that pronoun.
That's interesting. I like the page that the link you shared. You emailed us the questions again. Because we write them down in class, but then you'll send them out in email, and you usually add a link for context. That was a fun read. It adds a little bit more context to the scholarly
think
discussion.
that was like the history of
writing specifically.
Yeah, there's lots of articles about that because, of course, they did figure out who it was, and I don't think it was a...
Oh, no, I was talking about the gendered pronouns in formal writing.
Oh, yes.
And all the different, like what APA looks at it as with MLA, they're all following precedent. What strategies do they recommend for workarounds or whatnot? And there's kind of the informal history of they, and it's not as formally accepted in like scholarly work. My degree major uses such specific context that we can usually come up with another adjective, like participant, consumer, client, subject. Interlocutor is the new one, the new formal.
I like that one.
Interlocutor, have you heard that?
Yeah.
Agent, which is just annoying to have to type every time you want to refer to subject A, the interlocutor.
You can actually make inappropriate jokes with some of the situations too.
I'm sure.
I obviously won't do that one, since it's inappropriate.
I think it'll create legal issues too.
I can imagine.
That's what I thought.
Oh, ambiguity?
In depositions, testimony, because if you write plural, the judge or the prosecutor or the attorney will come and say, talking about a singular here. I mean, just the exactness, because it has to be not a preponderance of evidence, but beyond a shadow of a doubt.
The murderer entered the room this way, and then they did such and such, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's the same
Talking
thing
about
as when
multiple-
you question someone to see whether they had a blue shirt on or a black shirt on. Did they have sweatpants on, or did they have jeans on? Was it one person or several people? It'll be interesting how they deal with that.
Just say defendant.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, the one
No
book
more pronouns.
that I had used in
But you as
class,
the person who's writing a testimony, you're not thinking that. Legal speak, they will.
Right.
But for me, they're like, here's a piece of paper right now, what you know.
I think I mentioned the problem I had in a class I gave at APU. The one year I assigned a book that was written in 1968, I think it was, Peter Berger's The Social Construction of Reality. And I had read that when I was in school, and thought it was a fantastic book and everything. I ended up getting complaints from some of the co-eds in the class because they realized that the book was male-oriented as it was written, that Peter Berger would always refer to he, the pronouns were always male. And I could read it and feel like, well, he's talking about in general. But at that particular time, attention was really being drawn to that typical use of male pronouns. And, are we going to say, in the beginning, God created man? What do you mean by that? Well, man in general. Well, no, he should say in, the beginning God created human beings or something, instead, So that was pretty interesting. Lots of cartoons I noticed in the local paper about the issue of, like in the one cartoon you have offended man. He's the new, hero or what, and he's got a shirt that has a big O on it, and he takes offense at everybody, and of course then it goes, well, I'm offended that you're offended, and it goes back and forth, all sorts of interesting stuff like that. And then the other one, I see a lot with, you know, like the little animals, the mouse, the rat, the pig, and they keep playing on this, being offended by things that others say, and they take it, of course, to the extreme ridiculous point at which it becomes funny, but you also wonder, how do people feel that truly have situations where they feel offended because of the way people naturally speak, because of
A new worldview.
right. And
Zeitgeist.
I'm still convinced, though, that English being more gender neutral and even having neuter and more, virtually everything is neuter, except for people and specific types of living creatures and or a ship. Ships, for some reason, tend to be female. A lot of people think of their cars as female. Kind of an odd sort of thing. But in general English, everything that's not a person basically is neuter. So we refer to it as it. And yet if you have a brand new baby, you say, what is it? That's wrong. It's male or female, right? I love, of course, in the Monty Python, The Meaning of Life, the sketch on birth. You know, the baby's, been born, they show it to the mother, they put it in the incubator, isolate the baby, if you've seen the really goofy movie. And then they leave, right? And the mother's still lying there with her feet in the stirrups, and she says, what is it? And John Cleese says, it's awfully early to be imposing roles on it, don't you think? Like you shouldn't be picking whether it's male or female already. Just make a mess out of that. Okay. Now I have no solutions, by the way, of course, with regard to what we should do in the Detroit situation. That's one of those immense puzzles. But the reason I bring it up is because Kant, in his arguments, is arguing that it should be universal. All men, including women, are rational, and so in a particular situation should know exactly what their moral obligation is, and that would be the categorical imperative, right? And then for him, the real problem is that, but a lot of those things that we know we ought to do are not something that we would like to do. We'd rather avoid pain or avoid putting ourselves in danger and so on. And so our problem is actually doing what we know to be the right thing. He feels that that's the moral problem that a lot of people have. Not having the strength of character to do what they know they ought to do.
You think he'd do it if it was right during the time when he has his daily walk?
Oh, would he do it if Well, I mean, if I look at Kant's life in particular, the way he treated his butler, actually, if you watch the whole movie, I thought he was very immoral to his butler, treated him like a mechanical being rather than a real person, because it really happened. The butler met and fell in love with a woman and decided to get married, and Kant interpreted that as disloyalty instead of wanting to stay his butler for his entire life. So he didn't give him any goodbye bonus or anything. He was mad at him. I mean, he did already bring in a replacement for him and everything. So he took care of Kant, as he best could, and yet he wanted to have his own life, obviously. So that was upsetting to find that Kant was basically being immoral, I thought, in the way he treated his butler. So I think we could find lots of people that felt that Kant's conceptions of what were absolutely moral were not moral in every context. So Kant, I conclude, is wrong, that our moral imperatives are universal. And so when we move into kind of the much more complex problem of solving what gives us these categories and how we view things, including our moral predicaments, culture turns out to be that grid work that we see things through, and culture changes, not only from place to place, from environment to environment. In fact, if we're thinking about women driving cars, like in Detroit, think about Saudi Arabia. Up until just recently, a woman wasn't allowed to drive a car in Saudi Arabia, and if you saw a woman driving a car and being chased by 4 ugly guys, and then being beat up, you figured that's what she deserved, because those are the police and they're beating her up for driving a car, when it's obviously immoral for women to drive cars in Saudi Arabia. I still don't think it's very easy for women to drive cars in Saudi Arabia. I think there are requirements still. Plus, I think
Vietnam is similar.
and they have to wear the burqa, which, you know, if I put on my hood, I can't see very well, so I don't think that's a good idea. Let alone try walking across the
You
street.
can't drive alone.
In Vietnam?
Saudi Arabia.
I know they have to have good teeth in Vietnam. If they have bad teeth, they can't get a driver's license. It's a very interesting prerequisite for a driving license. My friend's niece didn't have good enough teeth.
That's interesting.
That's interesting.
And I mean it in every sense of the word.
Photoshop.
There you go. Very,
Photoshop?
not sure, not healthy enough, quote unquote. I don't know what their cultural perspective on good enough is reference to health, appearance, prestige, I don't know.
I was reading about the
Representative.
women trying to get from Ethiopia to Yemen, and the whole story was absolutely horrific.
I didn't read that story.
It was in the paper last night, Washington Post. There's a lot of hellacious situations out in the world. We're incredibly lucky. I mean, I don't know what your individual life is like, but it's still way better than what a lot of people's lives are like out there, for sure. Well, tonight our first topic is Epicurus. And we're looking at that very brief reading. Epicurus's writings are not full length. Usually, if anything, we have a couple of letters, and they're not letters that we know for sure he's written, but instead they're letters that are incorporated in someone else's writing about him, usually. But you could still look them up. Of course, we could also look up Epicurus himself. So we pretty much know his life. You use Wikipedia. I found last night, reviewing this, that this page was pretty good. 341 to 270 BC or BCE, as your preference goes. I don't see there's a whole big difference between before the Common Era and before Christ. I don't know if you find either one to be. They still both have to be wrong, because whoever made up that switch over from BC to AD, Anno Domini, or, I don't think there's a change in Anno Domini, right? That's, or do we just say common era? I think so. So it must be CE or something. They forgot year 0. So there's 1 year that's totally, you go 1 BC and then 1 AD, which couldn't happen actually, because there had to be a year 0, right?
I never thought
Had
of
to
that.
start. That's just, there's all kinds of just crazy stuff about all of that. By the way, remember this weekend we move fall step back. No, spring.
Fall back, spring
Fall
forward.
back, thanks. I get that. That's
Well,
an
that's-
easy thing to remember, and I can't remember.
It's Sunday.
Sunday,
That's a hard one.
2 a.m.
Yeah.
2 a.m.
It's a hard one though to not get mixed up. I get it
Well,
mixed up.
Do you wanna set it back here?
The whole
It's really close right there.
situation is absolutely kind of hilarious when you try to figure out, when did they first start clocks? And when they started clocks, who decided there would be 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute? And the Babylonians, well, but they didn't have clocks that could do that. They were the ones that gave us the 360 degrees and so on. And I hope you know that the reason the Babylonians did all that was because their number system was base 60. Did you know that?
I didn't realize it was base 60. I know there's base
Base-
10 and base 12 out there.
And when you look at their counting system with the cuneiform things, they base 60. Which if you think ours is base 10, and you think that's the most natural thing in the world, base 10, probably. But that's not the only one. I learned that from Isaac Asimov. He was actually quite an interesting writer, and and he wrote, I don't know how many books he wrote, but he picked a topic and he just wrote everything you could find on that topic that he went. And he did one on number systems and things. That was absolutely fascinating. But we're in a time zone. Normally they talk about the US as having 4 time zones, but that's not true, because of course that's the
Yes.
contiguous US. We're in a 5th time zone. In fact, don't we have one
Why?
down in the,
6. Yeah, you've got Hawaii's got some.
and the Panhandle has a half hour off or something, as far as I know. People in a few towns in Alaska are a half hour behind us, I believe.
You said Panhandle, I was thinking Florida.
Can we fact check that with Google?
We
Are
could.
they half hour ahead of us?
Yeah.
So Panhandle is
Somebody
further
had
east,
that.
they're closer to the Pacific time.
What's the weekly password?
Good question. I read it and then oh shoot, where's my mail? I'm not in the right browser, I don't think. I'm not. I'm in Firefox. I've never been in Firefox. They set this up for me. Where? Let's try this. There we go. So many steps. Goodness.
Is it hexadecimal in space 16? For encoding binary, secondary step, I think it's hexadecimal, or you need the alphabet on there.
I have no idea even what you're talking about.
It's hexadecimal, they code binary. I think it's hexadecimal.
says it's me.
Cause I think that's the other one I was thinking of, not base 12, but base 16 for computer encoding, specifically for compressing data. To compress it down from whatever its raw code is to.
Here it is. Pledge.
Thank you.
Sorry it took me so long to find it. Oh, what about this one?
Can't imagine a base 60 system.
So Epicurus. So we consider Epicurus to be a post-Aristotelian. Literally, he is, I think, born in 341. I think Aristotle died in pretty close. Diogenes Laertes is the one where we get most of the writings that we're looking at. The letter to Menocius, the letter to Herodotus, and the letter to Pythocles. And they're also like student notes and things. But he's like born, I think, like the year after Aristotle dies, or it's pretty, or he goes to Athens the year after Aristotle has gone to Lesbos, where he dies a year later. After so Alexander the Great dies in what? 323? I forget. But yeah, Google is totally taking away the need to actually remember all of the specifics.
You're correct. 320.
323. Huh. That's just dumb luck, though. I can't believe I actually remembered it. But so strictly speaking, Epicurus is a post-Aristotelian. He lives after Aristotle and is influenced by Aristotle. So that's kind of cool. I should actually have like maybe I'll write on the board. Would that be all right? I'll have to erase it. But I will put stuff on the board tonight. What do you think? Because this is kind of neat how this works out.
There you go.
So if we think Socrates, we can use him as a base, I guess. From Socrates, we can say Plato. And from Plato, we can say Aristotle. With roughly 20 years overlap each way. But then after Aristotle, then we have Diogenes, who's a cynic. Now, obviously Diogenes lives while Aristotle's still alive too, because one of the stories about Diogenes, the cynic,
Is the guy who lives in the jar? The giant
Barrel.
pot? Barrel?
barrel, I would say.
He's all listen.
Yeah, lives in the
Some of the
barrel.
most famous comebacks of all time.
Yep. But and so one of the stories is when Alexander sees him lying there and comes over to talk to him because he's heard about this famous philosopher. And so he says hello and he asks Diogenes, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes says, "Yes, you could get out of my sun," because he was blocking the sun. And Ptolemy was next to Aristotle, or rather Alexander, Alexander the Great,
Oh,
right?
that Alexander.
Not Alexander, right? In case at least one of you is named Alexander here. but, which by the way means savior of men. If you ever checked your name.
Son's middle name is Alexander.
But, so Ptolemy was like, uh-oh, that's the end of Diogenes. But instead of killing Diogenes for the cheek, or whatever you want to call that kind of the sass, wouldn't be a good expression, right? Instead, Alexander stood proudly and said, if I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes. So, but that's just a story, who knows? But Diogenes is a cynic, which is also the root word for canine, where we get the dog, the name now in Latin for dog, canine, but it comes from the Greek. So it's the dog philosophy. The cynic is the dog philosophy, literally, right? And the goal of the cynic is to live the dog's life, basically. The dog is the role model for this philosopher. Basically, that's why he's not wearing clothes, he's not concerned with his social status or anything. He's just kind of begging for food, but standing on pillars during the day and professing all sorts of sayings and things. So basically begging. And so it's kind of like the homeless lifestyle on purpose. So it's not like he's homeless because he's mentally ill or anything, I suppose, but instead homeless on purpose because he doesn't want any of the care or concerns that he would have to have if he were going to have a family and have a house and drive a car, which they didn't back then.
So he was the first tiny house enthusiast.
I don't think so.
Living in a barrel?
No, I would think that there were plenty of folks that lived in even smaller places even before him. But he's clearly one of the more famous tiny house enthusiasts. In any case, so is there kind of a goal of that philosophy to have the best life possible, to live the happiest kind of life, assuming that what would mess up your life would be all of the hassles associated with having a job and having social obligations and that sort of thing. So
Epicurus now, right?
Epicurus. No, Diogenes. I'm sorry.
Okay, because I thought Epicurus said the same thing.
Well, Epicurus, I'm going to just move over one.
Life should be directed to the pursuit of happiness.
So that's Epicurus. Certainly Diogenes would agree with that, but there's a difference in how they think they can accomplish that. And that's because this philosopher wants to live in the garden. That's what he calls his estate. He's actually wealthy. And he has students, and there was a place that he literally had a large estate. That was, the goal, I guess, was to be self-sufficient, have your own garden. I don't believe, though, that Epicurus was the one that did any of the gardening. I think he had servants doing all the work. I'm not really sure. But so he had an estate, he had a wealthy life in Athens, at least for about 15 years, towards the end of his life. He had been in different places before that. But, so he has a garden, nice walled-in area where, and his teachings basically are to tell you that yes, we want to have the happy life, but it's complicated. It's more complicated than Diogenes, Diogenes just doesn't want any hassles whatsoever, and just figures things will come to him. By the way, there's an interesting argument in a book by Robert Funk. I don't know if I mentioned this already or not, but Robert Funk argues that when you look at the life that St. John the Baptist led, he was basically living a life of the cynic, following Diogenes' recommendations. And of course, Jesus could be interpreted as a follower of St. John the Baptist, and in many respects, Jesus, if you look at kind of life he led, Robert Funk argues that Jesus, as a follower of St. John the Baptist, was a cynic philosopher as well, so that basically you've got a chain here of cynic philosophers that includes Jesus. That's Robert Funk, and the title of one of his books is Honest to Jesus, if you're interested. So that's I'll tie that in there. But so the cynic gives us one way of trying to have a happy life. The Epicurus gives a different one, and his philosophy ends up getting a name based on his name, so it's Epicureanism. It's his own philosophy, Epicureanism. And one of the more famous things is you don't have to worry about death. Death bothers a lot of people, they worry about it, and the worry about dying is the worst of it. Because while you're alive, you're not dead. And while you're dead, you don't feel anything anymore, so there's no pain associated with death, so don't worry about it, right?
Right,
That's the
because
basic.
philosophy argues happiness through the absence of pain, right?
Right. But he is a little bit more complex than that. Sometimes you have to put up with the pain. My wife says next week we're going to get our flu shot. Ugh. I hate getting my flu shot. But I have to admit, I don't really relish the idea of getting the flu. But even worse, in my case, if I don't get my flu shot when my wife tells me to get it, there's hell to pay. Because my wife is very persistent about making sure that I get my flu shot. And she loves being present when I get it because she loves watching someone stick needles in me.
Where she doesn't think you'll get it.
Pardon?
Where she doesn't think you'll get it.
Yeah, she knows I'll no, well, I won't lie. I'll tell her I didn't get it yet. Shoot, but so you do have to take some pain for the shot is just a little prick or a little whatever, how they usually say. And then they come out of the closet with this humongous hypodermic needle, jab it in you, say, okay, it'll be over in 5 minutes. You know how they do.
That's the anthrax shot,
Yeah.
where they shake it, cool it, and then they inject it, and then hit you in the arm with a bat. That's
Well, I still remember basic training when you would go through the rows of people that would get you on both sides.
Anthrax.
And then I watch all the people arguing over whether or not injecting your children with
Oh, yeah.
vaccines is going to give them all sorts of weird, I don't know. But so yes, it's more complex than just avoiding pain and seeking happiness. Plus, what kind of happiness should you go after? A nice, rational kind of happiness. He's not moderation, yeah. So there's an interesting dilemma, though, that a lot of folks misinterpreted Epicurus. I'm going to turn